Hello and welcome to SRIRAM's IAS, a teaching and a coaching institution that is meant for young adults who aspire to join the civil services. Today's topic of discussion is the World Trade Organization. And I have with me today a person who is eminently qualified to speak on the subject. He's arguably one of India's foremost experts on international trade. So let me welcome Professor Biswajit Dhar. Professor Biswajit Dhar is currently with the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was earlier the Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. And he was also the professor and head of the Center for WTO Studies at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. He's been a senior consultant with the Planning Commission, and over the last several decades, he's either collaborated with or worked with various United Nations agencies, or he's been a consultant with some of them, and these include UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UN SCAP, or the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and he also worked with the multilateral Manila-based financial institution, the Asian Development Bank. And Dr. Biswajit Dhar is focused on, he's specialized in looking at international trade and international development issues and international finance, intellectual property rights, among others. So thank you so much, Professor Dhar, for giving us your time.
My pleasure.
Let me first ask you a very, very general question. And if you can sort of explain for those who are hearing you and watching you, it's 25 years since the World Trade Organization has been in existence. Since it replaced another body called GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, if you look at these 24 years, if you can give a brief overview on what has it achieved? Has it achieved in ensuring a rules-based international trading system with a sort of well-defined dispute settlement mechanism? So I'd like you to talk in general about what the World Trade Organization has achieved over the last quarter century.
Thank you, Paranjoy, and thank you for inviting me to this session. It's really a pleasure for me to speak to you on this issue. Now, let me go a little back. You started from 1995, but I'll go behind to the 40s when the institution that the WTO replaced, what you mentioned as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, it's not an institution per se, but it was a kind of an ad hoc agreement. The GATT was signed in 1947 with 23 countries. Let me give you a backdrop as to why there was the need to have an agreement called the GATT and what was the motivation. So, really the GATT, and it was supposed to be called the International Trade Organization, which never came into existence, was one of the three institutions that were to look after the post-war economic governance. And you know that the war came out of when the war started. The world economy came out of the Great Depression of the 30s, and one of the major problems of the 30s was that countries were at each other's throats and trying to capture markets. So when there is a downturn, and you can see even now, most countries are getting protectionist, even and as we are talking today. So depression brings in this kind of protectionism, and this was seen to be bad for the global economy because as economists say that promotes bigger thy neighbor policy. So no one is, no one gains out of protectionism. Everyone loses. So
I mean, I'm interrupting you just to explain in a few sentences what you meant by beggar thy neighbor policy.
Yeah, I was coming to that. So basically, when countries try to protect their markets, they do it with the motivation of protecting their own jobs and incomes. But they do it at the expense of the other partner countries. So, the other countries then start retaliating, and we saw it very well over the past 2 years when the US started this whole trade war, raising tariffs to protect its own markets. And then China retaliated, and there was the whole the situation went out of control because the two largest economies were really engaged in this trade war. So the global economy started getting into a crisis mode from 2018, and we have seen this happen quite frequently over the past several decades. So bigger than neighbor policy is never a good policy. You're not helping anyone. So a conference was convened just as the war was sort of coming to an end in 1944, and this was in a place called Bretton Woods in the US. And this Bretton Woods conference was convened by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. And the idea was, as I said, let's look at the post-war economic governance and how it's to be managed. And one of the institutions that came out of the discussion was a rules-based trading organization that you mentioned. That the key word that one has to associate with the earlier GATT and now the WTO is this rules-based. So it actually sets up a set of rules by which all the countries who are members of this organization have to play. And the bottom line is that that countries must benefit from trade. And there's a very interesting quotation, and I'll ask Paranjoy to put it up later on the screen. I'll share it with you. The opening paragraph of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and also the WTO, it actually talks about trade as being the handmaiden of development, of rising incomes, creating effective demand, and those are the objectives which are put up front. And then to achieve those objectives, you are freeing trade. So, I've always argued that, trade liberalization per se has not been the objective of the multilateral trading system. The multilateral trading system has used trade liberalization. The motivation was to use trade liberalization to promote the larger objectives of development, of solving the problem of unemployment, of creating demand, effective demand in the economy, and so on and so forth. And now, of course, you also have this very important objective of realizing sustainable development. So all these are actually packaged there. So we started with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was, as I said, was signed in 1947. There were 23 countries which signed the GATT, and India was one of the founding members. India, in fact, even before we got independent, we were participating in the negotiations in the run-up to the GATT agreement. And so the GATT was signed in October 47 with the intention that the very next year, the International Trade Organization will come into existence. But the US did not allow this to happen because, when any country joins an international organization, and this is a very important fact that everyone should understand, that you give up a part of your sovereignty. You give up the right to have your independent trade policy to an extent. Yeah? For instance, today, the government of India's the tariff policies, what kind of import duties we will impose, those are, regulated by the WTO. We have made certain commitments in the WTO to keep our tariffs at a particular level, not go beyond them. Yeah, so all these issues are part of the rules, and therefore, when US saw that this is going to happen, that its own independent trade policy making is going to be circumscribed by joining of the GATT, they refused, because at that time US was the emerging global power, and they wanted to exercise complete freedom in establishing their large footprint on the global economy through trade, obviously, and they didn't want to become they didn't want this organization to come into existence. So GATT remained an ad hoc agreement. Some rules were formed, were decided on by the countries, and that was the way GATT continued until there was a decision again by among the big countries like the US, the European Union, Japan, Canada. We used to call them Quad in the WTO, in the trading system. So the Quad decided that now time has come for us to have an organization which we did not put into place in 1948. So at that point, the WTO came into existence in 1995.
So, Professor Dhar, in the 25 years that the WTO or the World Trade Organization has been in existence, I want you to give a brief outline on what it has achieved and what it has not achieved. Before we get into some of the questions that you've raised, the Bretton Woods conference was not just that the International Trade Organization never got formed, but the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was set up. So before we delve a little deeper into issues of protectionism, multilateralism versus bilateralism, I'd like you to give a little bit of an overview of what in the last 25 years would you say have been the achievements of the World Trade Organization, and what have been its biggest failures?
Yeah, so the World Trade Organization, as I said, it followed the footsteps of the GATT in putting, development objectives upfront, and the WTO. So one big change. Let me talk about how the transition from the GATT to the WTO took place, and the transition took place through the Uruguay round negotiations. This was the 8th round of the GATT negotiations, and I should have mentioned earlier that when the countries were deciding on the rules, and each time they were they sat together and deliberated on amending the rules or having new rules. Each of these meetings used to be called a round of negotiation. So under the GATT, there were 8 rounds of negotiations, and the 8th round was the most significant, the Uruguay round, which started in 1986. And there, the 2 major decisions were taken in the run-up to the Uruguay round negotiations. The first was that, again, I should have mentioned earlier, the GATT was the rule making of the GATT was restricted to trade in goods. Because if you look back on the world of in the 40s, late 40s, services was not really a very important factor. Even trade in technology was really in its infancy. We were talking about technology transfer those days, not really technology trade. So the first decision was that these are 2 areas which have become very important as far as cross-boundary transactions are concerned, between countries are concerned, and there must be certain rules, framed for these areas as well as has been done for the trade in goods. So these 2 areas, services and intellectual property rights. A lot of people ask the question, why intellectual property rights? Because intellectual property rights is really the framework of intellectual property rights really control the dynamics of technology flows between the developer of technology and the user of technology. And if the user of the technology is a developing country or a country which is lagging in terms of technology race, and the developer of the technology is of course the developed countries, then there is a possibility or actual technology trade taking place between these two countries, and therefore these areas where intellectual property rights was brought in. Services, for obvious reasons, services has become a very important component of trade, and it's actually complements and supplements trade in goods in several different ways. And let me also here mention that we know very easily what goods trade involves. It's just sort of shifting goods across the international boundaries. But in case of services trade is a little more complicated because there are different modes through which services trade take place. So there are 4 modes which have been identified. The first mode 1, is called these are basically where the buyer and the seller of service, they don't meet each other physically. They're actually meeting in the virtual space, and the best example there is the BPO operations, the call centers, where the demandiers of the services are sitting in the US and the developed countries, and here from India, Gurgaon and other places, there are these call centers which are responding to the requirements of these companies, banks, whatever, in the US.
Essentially what you call business process outsourcing.
That is right. So these are, I was coming to that, this is called the BPO operations. The second mode is where, it's called consumption abroad, where the consumer of a service comes to a producer of a service. And the best example is a tourist coming and availing of all the services, hotels, transport and whatever. So that's, now medical tourism has become a very important service for India, or the patients come to India. So this is called consumption abroad. The third mode of service is where the seller of the service comes to the buyer of the service. Yeah, and which is again the good example is foreign banks coming here and setting up shop. Yeah, and so this actually takes place through investments by foreign companies into a host country, and the services are delivered. And the fourth mode is movement of natural persons. So naturalized persons or people who are citizens of a particular country, they can move to another country. And again, the best example there is Indians going to the United States, and they are given entry through these H-1B visas or L-1 visas, and this has to be a very clear distinction between immigration and mode 4. These people only go. This is called temporary movement of natural persons. It's not permanent movement. So there's a job, they finish their job and come back. So that is mode 4. So these are the 4 modes. Now in the WTO, apart from these two agreements, the General Agreement on Trade in Services or the Agreement on Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, several other agreements. And again, there was the whole idea was to discipline the markets, to make the markets more transparent and predictable. And as I said, that with a view to helping the development needs of countries who need them. So the most important agreement among these is the agreement on agriculture. Then we have one agreement which has been there, and I'm just taking up examples which are of interest to India. For a long time, the textiles and clothing trade was controlled by quotas in the developed countries. So there was an agreement on textiles and clothing, which was done to phase out all the textiles quotas. Then we have the issues regarding non-agricultural products, and to make facilitate trade in non-agricultural products. So why do we call them non-agricultural and non-manufacturing products? Again, there is a long history. I don't want to get into it, because in the non-agricultural products is also some of the tropical products like jute, like rubber, which are agricultural products, but they don't get counted as agriculture in the WTO. In the WTO, because there's a long history to it. I don't have the time to actually go into that, but I think one has to understand this. And these are called non-agricultural products. And non-agricultural products basically they come from, most of these products are they have their history in the old GATT system, and they are the whole idea is to lower their tariffs to make the trade better. The third set of another set of agreements is what we call trade defense measures, and which is, there are three agreements there. One is called an anti-dumping agreement, and the anti-dumping has been very commonly used in India, and against whom? Against China. China has been massively dumping its products into India, and dumping, as you all know, is selling below cost of production. So there are ways in which anti-dumping is established, or sorry, dumping is established, and then anti-dumping duties are imposed. Then there is another agreement on subsidies and countervailing duties. Many countries use subsidies and for industrial products, because these subsidies and countervailing duties, subsidies are also there in agriculture. I'll come to that in just a moment. And whichever country is using certain actionable subsidies, their subsidies need to be countervailed by using higher tariffs, so that unfair advantage does not accrue to the country which is granting subsidies. So here the trade rules are try to be fair to everyone. And the final safeguard, final trade defense measure is called the safeguard agreement, where if there is very large surge of imports taking place all of a sudden, and which has either damaged the domestic industries or is threatening to damage the domestic industry, then the country which is affected that can use higher subsidies, safeguards, to safeguard duties to protect its industry. So in broad sweep, these are the areas, and agriculture, as I said, is the most important and also the most.
Okay, but before I come to agriculture, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. And specifically, I'd like you to explain what TRIPS is all about, and has it benefited India? And after that, you can talk about trade in agriculture.
Okay. Okay. So, as I said that, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS agreement, that was done to really regulate the technology flows. And how is it done? It is done by giving a larger control over the technologies to the companies or the individuals who are developing these technologies. So that there are all the different forms of human excellence, the creativity, and which actually manifests in creativity, those can be protected using one or the other form of intellectual property right. So in case of industrial technology, the form of intellectual property right that is used is patent. Then you have copyright for creativity for writers and others, and then you have newer forms of intellectual property rights. Also, like for instance, there is a new form which was introduced by the GATT, by the WTO, called the plant varieties protection, for protecting the rights of the breeders. So there are a number of areas. There's also one other area which is important for India, which is called the geographical indications. This is like a trademark, but it is given to a product whose the quality, the distinct quality of which is known because it originates in a particular place. Say for instance, Alfonso mangoes. It actually originates in a particular part of the country. Darjeeling tea or Kanjivaram silk. So all these products, niche products, they can be protected using the geographical indications. Now, the area which has been most contentious and the most difficult for India is two, but I'll focus more on the patents. Plant varieties protection also has been a problem. In patents, what has happened is that the major requirement under when countries acceded to the TRIPS agreement was that the countries had to strengthen their patent laws. Now, India, has had a patent law since 1856. So it actually predates the British rule. We had one of the earliest countries to have a patent law, and we have had a patent law which I would call I won't like to use the term nationalist because it has many different connotations, but it suited the interest of the country, and this was enacted in 1970. Yeah, and so when we joined the WTO and became acceded to the TRIPS agreement, we had to change that our old patent law in several ways. The first was that the patent is given for a fixed period of time, and TRIPS requires a patent to be given for 20 years. But in our case, in India, before we joined the WTO, we had the term of patent was either 7 years, and this was for the drugs and pharmaceuticals, or 14 years for other areas. The second important amendment that we had to make was that India did not give a patent on a product before we joined the WTO in case of pharmaceuticals. So in a pharmaceutical, if the patent had to be taken, it could be taken only for the process, the method of manufacturing, but not for the product per se. So the common medicine we take for fever and on paracetamol. So paracetamol could not be patented in India, but the process for manufacturing paracetamol could be patented. And this gave a huge advantage to many of our drug companies, the small companies which are coming up in the 70s and the 80s. And they could actually, develop new processes, novel processes for existing products, and they became real world beaters. India today produces pharmaceuticals which are among the cheapest in the world, and we have markets all over the world, especially in the developed countries, in the US and the European Union. So that window had to be closed. Then there are other remedies that we use, because patent is basically a monopoly. because it gives a monopoly to the person who has actually developed the product for 20 years. And you know what happens in monopolies? The monopoly tends to be misused. Yeah, and in pharmaceuticals, which is a very important area, if someone misuses a patent by charging high prices for the product, then of course the patient is interests are really harmed. So our patent law had an instrument called compulsory licensing, which was that which could be used when the prices of the products were high, and this was a determination had to be made by the government. So anyone wanting to produce that product which was being sold at a high price, any company could be given a license by the government, and this had to be, it was compulsory. So the patent holder could not refuse the license. It was granted by the government, and of course a royalty had to be paid to the person who had, or the company which had developed the product or the process. Now these, so we have used this, we have retained some of these flexibilities. Of course, we could not lessen the term of patent, which is 20 years. We could not have a process patent alone regime, which we had in our drugs. So we changed all that, but we retained the compulsory licensing route. That we did. And one other important amendment that we, or rather novelty that we introduced in our Patent Act was that someone, because this is a tendency which is seen in the US, where a company may have actually developed aspirin, or aspirin is a medicine which was developed many decades ago, but newer uses of aspirin or newer formulations of aspirin, new combinations of aspirin are still being patented, which means that the term of 20 years becomes irrelevant. And this is something that we called evergreening. So every 20 years a company would come and produce a new formulation and take a patent and extend the patent life ad infinitum. Yeah. So we have actually prevented that in our patent law. We don't allow this kind of evergreening. Okay. Yeah. So let me just finish here. So just to say why this is contentious, because the United States and the big pharma companies who are interested in doing business using these provisions of the TRIPS agreement, they don't like these flexibilities we have provided in our law, and the US is constantly sort of arguing with us to remove all these flexibilities. And the impact that will have, because then the government will have no instrument to control the prices of medicines if the compulsory licensing system is taken off, or if the non-patentability of all these formulations or new uses are that is thrown out of the Indian patent law. Then then there'll be evergreening and patent monopolies will persist in some of the important products.
Okay.
So that's why I think this is becoming important.
And I think it's becoming even more important today, because we are right now going through a situation where there's a pandemic. But before I ask you to talk a little bit about the Doha round, I'd like you to talk a little bit about trade in agriculture, because that too is very important for India. And within trade in India, the issue of subsidies and the issue of trade vis-a-vis livelihoods of farmers. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So agreement on agriculture was really put in place to do two things. The first was that most countries, and especially the developed countries, used very high levels of subsidies, and the subsidies are of different kinds. They use production related subsidies, give input subsidies, or subsidies for power, irrigation, like the kind of subsidies we give. Then they give export subsidies, yeah, and various other forms of supporting their farmers. And the one thing that you must remember is that if you look at the international trade on agriculture, you would expect, if the kind of trade theory that we teach.
Hello. Okay. Okay. All right.
So yeah.
There was a break. Okay. So let me start again from that point where we talked about agriculture. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me, in a sense, go back and ask the question to you again, and we'll cut and paste this. Okay, thank you, Professor Dhar, for outlining the impact on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights on India's pharmaceutical industry. I'd like you to talk a little bit now on agriculture, the agreement on agriculture, because that too has important, I mean, India is, it concerns India very, very much. And I want you to sort of link issues pertaining to the livelihoods of farmers and trade in agricultural commodities.
Yeah. So let me start with the motivation for having an agreement on agriculture, and it was basically done to address two sets of issues. The first was to discipline the subsidies, and the second was to promote agricultural trade. And of course, the underlying motivation, as always in the WTO, was to protect the development interests. And here, as you rightly said, about looking after the food security and livelihood needs of the developing countries, especially the least developed countries. So this was the overall sort of framework. Now, the subsidies is a major issue because most of the developed countries, especially the US and the European Union members, they give huge subsidies of different kinds. They give production-related subsidies, input subsidies, and stuff like that. And they also give export subsidies. And as a result, their products are today ruling they're dominating the agricultural markets. You would actually expect the developing countries, which are have the advantage of being being relatively cheaper, their agricultural production, since it's uses a lot of cheap labor, they would have the advantage, but that's not the case. It's the developed countries which are dominating market using high levels of subsidies. Then for a country like India, for instance, we're really worried that the cheap imports from the developed countries would come into our markets, and therefore, to protect our markets, we use high levels of tariffs. So the import duties on agricultural products, especially those which are important for India's food security, those in those products, the tariffs, the import duties are very high. So there is the constant tension between the developed and the developing countries, and you can see this happening very clearly between the constant back and forth that goes on between India and the United States. In the India's primary interest in agriculture is to protect the interests of a very large segment of farmers, which are mostly small and marginal farmers. Almost 90% of our farmers are actually small or marginal farmers, and for them, it's very important to protect their own food security and livelihoods. Of course, the overall food security of the country is also important, and the government has the responsibility of protecting these farmers, because see, one of the problems of our sort of development experience has been that we have not been able to shift people out of land or the rural areas as much as we as much as we would have wanted to. Even today, almost 60% of the workforce is directly or indirectly dependent on the rural areas, which is actually centered on agriculture. So for the country as a whole, it's very important that the livelihoods and food security interests of this country are protected, because we also have the experience of what happened in the 60s. When India was dependent on imports, the US actually was able to use its lever and to get certain political concessions from India. And we don't want to be in a situation, back to that situation where we are completely dependent. We used to call that situation ship-to-mouth existence, because when the American ships used to come to a harbor, we used to know that we are, at least we'll get some food. Otherwise, that wasn't a problem. So so agriculture has become very important. Our subsidies are under constant attack from the US. US wants us to lower our subsidies, but when we want to talk to them about their subsidies, they're absolutely adamant that they're not doing anything wrong. And there's always this finger pointing going on. Now, so I think agriculture is one area where India has to zealously protect its interests, come what may. And of course, we have the WTO rules that can protect us. But the one thing that we have to be very cautious about, that we should not actually bend. We should not be come under the kind of unilateral pressures that the Americans are putting on us, and the government should not be tempted to change the rules just because the Americans have some we have some strategic interest with the US administration today.
All right, Professor Dhar, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Doha round. What happened? Why did it get stalled? And many people accused India. Our commerce minister at that point of time was the late Murasoli Maran. He walked out. So many hold India responsible for the Doha round, because India wanted that developing countries should get some sort of a special and differential treatment. So the question is, the stalled round, the Doha round, can it be closed? Can it be successfully or amicably closed?
No, I don't. Yeah, let me, before I, give my own views on the future of the Doha round, let me just briefly tell you what the Doha round was. The Doha round was actually brought in the push for the Doha round came from the developing countries, who saw that the WTO framework was really not balanced, and it had too much in favor of the developed countries, and they want, and India, Brazil, South Africa, many others, African countries and Latin America. We wanted to rebalance the WTO agreements, various agreements, from agriculture to intellectual property rights to what have you, even the dispute settlement process. We wanted to change those agreements, amend those agreements so that they become more development friendly. And as I said, that development was at the core of the WTO, of the GATT at the WTO, and it was actually mainstreamed in the Doha, the mandate that was given to the countries by the ministers at the Doha Ministerial Conference in 2001. So, and therefore, Doha round was also called the Doha Development Agenda. It was a development at the core of this. So, there are many things that we demanded. Like I mentioned, that today in the world of agricultural trade, developing countries find it very difficult to stay in the business because the developed countries use so high subsidies. So we wanted to, quickly reduce the subsidies. And then we said that as long as the subsidies don't come down, we should be we should have the right to increase our tariffs, not be bound by certain tariffs that we agreed when we joined the WTO. Then in case of intellectual property rights, we realized that the prices of medicines could not be controlled as much as we wanted using when we were implementing the TRIPS agreement. So we wanted to change that. And there was a whole range of issues which were focused on mainstreaming development in the WTO. Now, obviously, the reason that the Doha Development Agenda did not proceed was that the countries which had the control of the international trade, of the international markets, they would not like to let go their control. So if you're talking about agricultural trade becoming more equitable, that doesn't seem suit the interests of agribusiness in the United States. And they are a very powerful political lobby, the US agribusiness, and they would not like to relent. Similarly, the farmer companies, the big pharma as we call them, these companies have tremendous financial power, and they are dominating the global market, and they don't care if the patients don't get access to medicines. So again, for them, absolutely, access to medicines at affordable prices. For them, their own profits are most important. They have to be protected under all circumstances. So the developed countries are actually hitting against this huge stone wall of domination by the developed countries who would not let go their dominations. And despite a huge coalition on the side of the developing countries, at one point there were 109 countries which were with India supporting the Doha, in India, Brazil, South Africa, and the leaders of this developing cohort world. They're supporting them, but yet the small group of developed countries with their sort of financial power, with their kind of political influence, they were able to have their say, and then they blocked the Doha round. And of course, then they started pointing fingers at us, saying that no, it's the developing countries which are actually demanding too much. It's something like the old Oliver Twist story. Suddenly, the Oliver Twist goes and says he wants more, and then he's thrown out. So the exact parallel happened in the WTO, where the developed countries were seen to ask too much of the developing countries were seen to ask too much of the developed countries, and the doors were shut. And for the last 12 years, the negotiations have got stalled. Negotiations have actually gone into other areas where the domination of these countries and their companies will increase, like e-commerce, like sort of protecting for investment and other areas. These are new areas which have come in. if you ask me, the Doha round, the Doha development agenda is as good as dead. It's not going to be revived. There is no political will, and now, unfortunately, even in the developing countries, most developing countries, they do not have the political will to get back and to the table to revive the Doha round.
Okay.
And current trust. Just one last line, that right now we are the new DG of the WTO. The decision is being taken to appoint a new DG of the WTO, and there are three contenders, and none of the contenders have talked about reviving the Doha round. So that's what the situation
I'm going
is.
to come to the new Director General of the World Trade Organization. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we could expect in the run-up to the June 2021 Kazakhstan 12th Ministerial Conference. But before I ask you these questions, I'd like you to make a few general observations. If the Doha development agenda is as good as dead, would you also say that the consensus on multilateralism in international trade is also as good as dead? And this again is something that's happening across the world, in developed countries, in developing countries. I mean, we are seeing regional trade blocs, free trade agreements. And so the question is, has the WTO outlived its utility? Is this a going back on globalization, back to regionalism? And we have seen India has been holding a series of ministerials. So the big question, is multilateralism in world trade gone? Is it a phase where it's over? And that would call into question the very raison d'etre of the existence of the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, I think we are, after, more than 70 years, the situation has come to this kind of a pass, that the multilateral order in trade or in other areas as well, but I'll just focus here on trade, is really under serious existential crisis, I would say. And that is because the countries which took the initiative to form the multilateral trading system, and these were the US, Great Britain at that time, and some of the European countries, who thought that a rules-based system would be good for them, at least in their trade. Today, at least some of these countries feel that that multilateral trade is not good, and the country which refused to let the International Trade Organization get established, the United States, is now back to the situation where it doesn't trust the multilateral system of rules. It wants to have its own rules, which are developed by or put in place by the US Congress, which of course just helps the US businesses. Like the US president always says that, US trade policies for the US workers, ranchers, and the companies. So that's where we have actually gone to. The first sign of the collapse of the trade, multilateralism in trade, came when President Trump virtually slammed the door on the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. We didn't talk about it, but the dispute settlement mechanism has a very important role, because it is an enforcer of rules in the WTO. So it really is a watchdog, to ensure that countries are implementing the rules, and they have a dispute settlement body, pretty much like a court that is there in most countries. And countries, the erring countries which are not falling in line, they're eventually they're required to fall in line. But US doesn't like this. When US has been pulled out for of preventing this to happen, according to Donald Trump, was to kill the dispute settlement body. So rules, but it cannot be enforced. So virtually you're in a situation where you are in a lawless kind of a world where trade rules will cease to exist, and countries, as you mentioned, would then do forum shopping. They would go and do trade deals with their preferred partners, and then the whole world will collapse from what is the first best option of a multilateral order, where there are predictable rules that everyone can understand, businesses can understand, there is transparency about rules, to one where there'll be multiplicity of rules. What Jagdish Bhagwati had actually said, the noodle bowl syndrome, where there are conflicting rules from these different trade agreements, which will come and clash into each other, and it'll make life hell for anyone doing business in the global markets. So I think that we are going towards a situation of anarchy in trade. We saw how the US and China, sort of the whole trade war panned out. We saw how US had targeted India, imposing tariffs on a number of products. US is still threatening India with a lot of actions on trade. So I think this is the new normal that we are reaching now, and it actually, in my view, doesn't augur well for the entire process of globalization.
Okay.
Because the process of globalization requires predictable and transparent set of rules which everyone would abide to, but that unfortunately is not happening.
Professor Biswajit Dhar, as you rightly pointed out, the US administration under Donald Trump completely paralyzed the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism. It blocked the working of that appeals body by not appointing judges. So effectively, the dispute settlement mechanism at the World Trade Organization got completely paralyzed. The incumbent Director General of the World Trade Organization, Roberto Azevedo of Brazil, he is retiring at the end of August. He's actually retiring in protest, 2 years ahead of the completion of his term. I mean, he had a 7-year term as the World Trade Organization's DG. And he's resigning because, I mean, he is extremely unhappy that the dispute settlement mechanism is not working, and among other things. And there is now, among the top contenders are Nigeria's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Kenya's Amina Mohammed. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what has been happening in the recent goings on in the World Trade Organization. And then after that, you could talk a little bit about what could be expected from the 12th Ministerial Conference in Kazakhstan, which is scheduled to take place in June 2021.
Yeah, the three contenders, the third one is a Mexican. From whatever we have heard of their pronouncements, we, at least I personally, not having too much of hope that they will be able to give the leadership to this organization that it requires. I think that it is very important for the WTO to stand up on its own principles and remember the preambular statement, the preambular paragraph of the Marrakesh Agreement that established the WTO, and to ensure that trade is beneficial to everyone, especially the developing countries, especially the countries which need to benefit from trade the most. So this was the sort of the foundation of the multilateral trading system. But as I said, that I have not heard a single statement by these three that gives me a lot of one thing that I mentioned earlier, that none of them has actually talked about the ground. They're talking about reinventing the multilateral system. They're putting it in a making it more relevant. Now these are the kind of words which make me, which trouble me, because, when you talk about making the institution relevant at a time when there is the big power domination over the global economy, that simply means that, you will be succumbing to the interest of the big powers. And you will not be actually, the interest of the smaller powers will be left, left in the lurch. Because, one has to understand that the global trade rules are needed by the smaller countries, not the bigger countries. The bigger countries can play by their own rules. They have the muscle power and money power. They can do that. But in smaller countries which can't take on the big countries, when there is unfair trade practices, and that is where the smaller countries need the trade rules. But if the trade rules become a handmaid of the larger countries, then the whole purpose of multilateralism in trade actually goes out of the window. And I don't think that is being, that is the objective of any of these three contenders. They just want the support of the big gun countries, and they just want to be in the saddle as soon as possible. Okay. So I think we are going through a very tough period in the WTO.
So in other words, could we? Are there any expectations that we should have from the June 2021 ministerial meeting, the 12th conference, the ministerial conference in Kazakhstan? I was told that there are certain issues on the table. These equal trade and women, trade and small enterprises, what we call MSMEs, micro, small and medium enterprises. I think there's also on the table the issue of e-commerce or electronic commerce, which has become very, very important. And of course, issues like subsidies to fisheries. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of these issues.
Yeah, there are, three issues which are directly related to trade, which is e-commerce, electronic commerce, because there are no rules on electronic commerce at this point, and there are different suggestions coming from the developed countries to deal with this issue. But one issue which is very important in electronic commerce is to make trade in all the goods that come through this platform duty-free, which means that, increasingly we are ourselves engaging, we are buying stuff from these e-commerce on this e-commerce platforms, also asking them to procure things from abroad. All these goods will come into the market duty-free, which means that there are two implications of this. That the moment you make all these imports duty-free, which means that for a country like India, many of our own companies will get threatened because we still impose certain tariffs in certain areas. And the second is that the government will lose customs duties if you make everything duty-free. So electronic commerce also has a very important aspect of data protection, because that the government of India had tabled a bill after civil society action that all the data that these e-commerce on these the digital the companies they collect on a real-time basis, they should not be allowed to leave this country. Yeah, and the reason was that information is the new oil, as they say. And the ones who have the control over information, over data, would actually dominate the marketplace. And today we don't have a single Indian company which is really doing substantial business on e-commerce platform. So the entire data that is being collected from you and me is going into the hands of the Amazons and the Walmarts of this world. And they can use this data about our spending behavior, our ways of sort of conduct ourselves, and they can actually dominate the market at the expense of the small traders of this country.
Okay.
And just imagine, the small traders go out of business. So e-commerce is a very important issue for us for multifaceted. The second area that you mentioned was the some kind of a discipline on micro, small, and medium enterprises. I've never been able to understand what it actually means, because you can't have global rules for MSMEs, because MSMEs, the definition of MSMEs differ vastly across countries. So MSME in India will not be an MSME in the US, and so on and so forth, or an MSME in a least developed country. So this is, I think, there are some certain hidden agenda out there. It's trying to tell us that that we are concerned about the small enterprises, but I think these will be hollow promises, if at all. The third is this whole issue of investment agreement. An investment agreement is very important, because investment per se is not a part of the WTO right now. And this agreement would give protection to foreign investors and almost a guarantee to do whatever they want to in the host countries. So a foreign investor comes to India under the investment laws. I don't have the time to go into the details. They can just sort of rake in as much of profits as possible, and at the expense of the consumers, at the expense of, even they can take the government to an private international arbitration, which is called the investor state dispute settlement mechanism. Through that, they can take the government to the dispute, and the government, even in India, we have had to pay huge damages to the foreign investors when we have lost the dispute. Okay. These disputes. So it's a one-sided thing. So these are three areas which are extremely troubling, that could have long-term implications. The trade in gender is a kind of Trojan horse which has been pushed in, because sounds very nice if you talk about gender, but what it means in actual terms is never very clear, because if you're undermining agriculture and you're undermining the women who are working in agriculture, what are you going to get? What positive outcomes are you going to get in trade in agriculture? That's the question I would like to ask. So, okay. 2021 Kazakhstan meeting is, I do not, as far as Indian interests are concerned, India's core interests are concerned, I do not look forward to it as something that is going to have any positive outcomes.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining these in such great detail. My last question to you, Professor Dhar, and this is something really, how young adults, who are aspiring to be civil servants, those who are being taught and coached and trained at SRIRAM's IAS, what does it really mean, the government of India's Atmanirbharta policy, self-reliance? This is not the first time governments are talking about self-reliance, but we are going through a pandemic. That pandemic in India isn't over. We are seeing across the world protectionism on the rise, much faster than before. We are not seeing international trade, world trade expanding, imports, exports. So given the current scenario prevailing in the world, what does Atmanirbharta, what does self-reliance imply or mean?
See, my view has been very clear that this is Atmanirbharta or self-reliance at this point in time is neither desirable nor is it feasible. The desirability of that, you yourself said that at a time when protectionism is on the rise, I think we can do without putting that extra kind of noise in the room, saying that we also want to jump into that the protectionist pool. So I think we should have desisted from doing that. As far as feasibility is concerned, India neither has the financial resources nor the technological resources to actually put the whole thing back. We are completely dependent. The way we have actually gone about it for the last several decades, we have completely neglected our manufacturing sector. We have not bothered or not really given any attention to fact that we need technology. We need to develop technology. We have tremendous talent pool in this country, and yet, you know, India is one of the most technologically dependent country. We depend on technology on foreign companies on almost everything, to the extent that there was a policy of, you know, it's an announcement a few, I think, years back, couple of years back, which said that, you know, we are opening our food processing sector to foreign direct investment. Now, surely this country has technology, has the know-how to process food. We don't need the foreign companies to come in, but if the foreign companies do come in, then whatever is there, our local knowledge will completely go out of the window, and you're not going to get, you're not going to be seeing them at all. So today, the government cannot actually go in for a sweeping thing like Atmanirbharta. You cannot, the one thing that you can, one way you can describe Atmanirbharta is that, you know, you would become autarkic, that you start just depending on yourself, on your producers, whatever they're producing. Now that can't be thing. My suggestion is that if the government does, and in certain areas we do need to stimulate our manufacturing sector, and this has to be strategically done. For instance, in the electronics area, you know, particularly the telecom, we do need strong, resilient domestic industries to come up. I mentioned about the pharmaceutical industry. We have a strong industry which provides formulations, which gives the tablets, sells the tablets all over the world. But the basic ingredient for manufacturing the tablets, which is called the active pharmaceutical ingredient, a very large proportion of that comes from China. Now that is unacceptable to me. So the government has to focus on these few areas in a strategic manner, promote domestic manufacturing. That will be the best contribution that we could make, in terms of Atmanirbharta, if we can do it in that way. Across the board, Atmanirbharta is, as I said, neither feasible nor desirable.
Thank you very much, Professor Biswajit Dhar, for holding forth at such length, in such detail, about the working of the international trading system at present, in particular the working of the World Trade Organization, for the young adults who aspire to be civil servants, who are being taught and trained at SRIRAM's IAS. Thank you once again for being with us. You've just heard Professor Biswajit Dhar. He's professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, a former professor and head of the Center for WTO Studies at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and an expert on international trade and development. Thank you for being with us.
It's been my pleasure.